The armor is ceremonial. The scars are the true record of service. Kalen Thorne spoke the words with a dry rasp that seemed to grate against the musical lilt of the princess's breathing. The air in the private chamber felt thick, ionized by the low hum of the bioluminescent walls. Lyra Vane stood frozen, her fingers hovering inches from the jagged, pale line of a plasma burn that carved a path across his ribs. Her skin, usually a steady, soft gold, was flickering into a panicked, ultraviolet rhythm. This was the ancient rite of truth. By forcing her to witness the reality beneath the metal, he had triggered a bond neither of them was prepared to carry. Her hand finally made contact with the heat of his skin. The sensation hit her like a physical blow, a primal connection that bypassed her neural shields entirely. It was an emotional whiplash she couldn't calculate. 30 minutes ago, Kalen had been nothing more than a silent, heavy shadow at the edge of a party he wasn't invited to enjoy. The Grand Hall of the Prism Citadel was a masterclass in optimization. Everything was light, glass, and refined ego. Princess Lyra moved through the crowd like a bird of paradise, her translucent robes shimmering with the inherited status of 1,000 years of peace. She had stopped in front of Kalen, her eyes tracking the heavy, dull gray of his kinetic plating. She called it an antique museum piece, her voice carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding nobles caught the joke. Lord Valerius had joined in, laughing a sound like chiming crystal while mocking the clumsiness of a species that still relied on metallurgy. Aunt Kalen had felt the cultural static rising in his gut. To the Ethel, beauty was efficiency, and his presence was a loud, ugly error in their perfect equation. In fact, he was a relic of a primitive era where people still had to bleed for their borders. The mockery had a sharp, entitled edge that finally snapped his professional tether. He had watched these people rely so heavily on their flickering energy shields, completely oblivious to the fact that perfection is a fragile mask. Their status was a fairy tale compared to the grit under his fingernails. He decided it was time they learned about the weight of things that don't shatter when the power goes out. Kalen began to unfasten the heavy seals of his chest plate, the metallic clatter echoing through the hall like a funeral bell. The court fell into an awkward silence as the first piece of history hit the floor. Surprisingly, he wasn't just removing equipment. He was stripping away the diplomatic lie that kept them comfortable. He moved with a slow, methodical gut instinct that terrified the advisors. They scrambled, their secondary hearts hammering visible patterns against their chests as they realized the human was invoking a law so old it had become a myth. The heat radiating from his chest was a revelation. To an Ethel, temperature was a managed variable, regulated by environmental subgrids. But Kalen was a furnace of biological intent. Lyra's fingers traced the uneven ridge of a shrapnel tear, her own glow shifting into a steady, grounding amber. She realized that while her people had spent eons perfecting the shield, this man had spent a lifetime perfecting the recovery. This was the difference between a soldier who wears history and a princess who mocks it. Ironically, the very armor she had ridiculed was the only reason his heart was still beating against her palm. Her xenophysiology was finally catching up to the gravity of the moment, her light settling into a pulse that mirrored the human's own rhythm. Her legal counsel had been frantic, whispering about loopholes in the corridors outside. They saw the bond as a stain on her lineage, a technicality to be scrubbed away. But Lyra watched Kalen's eyes. They weren't seeking an apology or a status upgrade. They were simply waiting for her to see him. She refused to dissolve the tie. In fact, she did something much more scandalous. She ordered the neural shields in the training quadrants to be powered down. The first weeks at the new camp were a mess of bruised egos. Ethel soldiers, stripped of their predictive combat AI, looked like hatchlings trying to walk. They were terrifyingly dependent on perfection. Kalen moved among them, a high-ranking advisor who taught them the magic of mundanity, how to breathe through a failing system and trust the weight of a physical blade. He taught them that resilience is what happens when the mirrors finally break. What happens when the shields flicker is the only truth that matters. Months later, the morning sun caught the glint of a new kind of protection. Lyra stood in the center of the yard, her silhouette changed. She wasn't wearing the delicate filaments of her station. Instead, she wore a hybrid suit of human-made composite plates layered with ethel light emitters. It was a cultural synthesis that looked heavy and strange, but it worked. Kalen approached her, his own movements less guarded now. He raised a training baton, a silent invitation. Surprisingly, she didn't flinch. She had learned the value of the tether that connected them. It wasn't just a legal obligation anymore. It was a shared understanding of how to survive in a universe that doesn't care about your pedigree. Lyra lunged, her movements a mix of ethel grace and human grit. When they finally locked blades, the impact sent a shudder through her arms that felt more real than any simulated light show. They stood there breathing in the same dusty air, two souls finally aligned in the messy, a beautiful reality of a world that required more than just a flicker of light to stay safe. She smiled, and for the first time, her glow didn't just reflect the room. It came from somewhere deep inside, warm, slightly awkward, and undeniably human. It was a soft, primal connection that no neural network could hope to replicate.